Today's topic is a listener request, so shout out to Dawn for suggesting the topic of today's episode. Dawn asked to learn about Siamese Fighting Fish, the animal, not the Danish rock band of the same name, in case you're familiar. Now, one of the best things about listener requests is that a lot of times they're things that I never would have considered. And most of the time when I start doing some research, I learn some really fascinating things, like that there's a Danish rock band called Siamese Fighting Fish, but also cool things about the actual animal. Siamese Fighting Fish, also known as Betta fish, absolutely falls squarely into that category. They're both interesting from a wildlife perspective, but they also have an interesting history with us humans. Now, just about anywhere that sells pets has a plethora of these beautiful fish in individual jars with their rainbow of colors and long flowing tail and fins. Because they are one of the most popular aquarium fish in the world, thanks to their diverse and colorful morphology and relatively low maintenance. But what are they? Where do they come from? Are there Siamese fighting fish swimming around out there in the wild? Well, let's find out together, shall we? I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. So Siamese fighting fish are a freshwater fish native to Southeast Asia, namely Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, Vietnam, and finally Thailand, which was called Siam until 1939, which explains at least part of the name. In fact, the Siamese fighting fish is the national aquatic animal of Thailand, which remains the primary breeder and exporter of these fish for the global aquarium market. Now, you might also commonly hear them called a betta or a betta fish, or incorrectly beta, but there are two T's in the spelling, so betta is the correct pronunciation. Now, we know why Siamese, but why betta? Well, because the scientific name for this fish is Betta splendens, which translates as splendid fighter. Now, Betta splendens is one of 76 species in the genus Betta, but it's the only one that we commonly refer to simply as a betta, thanks to that aforementioned global popularity as a pet. And yes, they still do have cousins in the wild. Betta splendens generally inhabits shallow bodies of water with abundant vegetation, so things like marshes and floodplains and paddy fields. The historic prevalence of rice farming across Southeast Asia provided an ideal habitat for bettas and led to their discovery and subsequent domestication by humans. Now, information on just exactly how and when Siamese fighting fish were first domesticated and brought out of Asia is a little bit on the sparse side. But genetic analysis implies that it happened at least 1,000 years ago, placing them among the earliest domestications for any fish. Additional evidence from DNA sampling suggests that bettas may have been bred for fighting since the 13th century. They were initially bred for aggression, and they were used in gambling matches, kind of like cockfighting. But just to be clear, in the wild, betta only spar for a few minutes at best before one of the fish retreats. Since domesticated betta were bred specifically for heightened aggression, they could engage in these sparring matches for much longer, but the winner was still determined by their willingness to keep fighting, and once their opponent retreated, the match was over. Fights to the death were extremely rare, so bets were placed on the bravery of the fish rather than its survival, so much less cruel and brutal than cockfighting. But still, since domesticated bettas were bred for fighting specifically, captive ornamental species tend to be more aggressive than their wild counterparts. Now, the popularity of these fights got the attention of the King of Siam, King Rama III, who not only started to regulate and tax the matches, but also collecting fighting fish of his own. In 1840, he gave some of his prized fish to Danish physician, zoologist, and botanist Theodore Edward Cantor, who worked in the Bengal Medical Service. 9 years later, Cantor published the first recorded article describing these fish, although he gave them a different scientific name at the time, which, as it turns out, was already in use for a different fish. So in 1909, British ichthyologist Charles Tate Regan renamed the domesticated Siamese fighting fish Betta splendens. As far as worldwide appearance in the pet trade, they first appeared in the West in the late 19th century. The earliest known instance was in France in 1874, and from there they quickly became a popular ornamental fish. They were brought into Germany in 1896, Australia in 1904, and they made it here to the United States in 1910. And with that popularity, breeders started selecting for different qualities. And of course, over time, all this selective breeding led to the diverse genetics of both modern domestic and wild bettas that we see today. The early 20th century was in fact the first known departure from centuries of breeding bettas for aggression, to instead selecting for color, finnage, and overall beauty. For example, in 1927, an article was published in Germany describing the long flowing fins of what was called the veil tail breed. In the 1950s, an American breeder created a bigger and longer finned veil tail. Around 1960, breeders in India discovered a genetic mutation that allowed for two caudal fins, and they produced what's called the double tail variety. And also in the 60s, a German breeder created the delta tail, which had broader, more triangular fins. And of course, within all that, there's a near endless variety of colors and patterns. Okay, so what about bettas in the wild? Well, we've already established that they prefer shallow bodies of water with abundant vegetation, but also surface foliage like fallen leaves or water lilies. This vegetation and detritus provides both protection from predators and a buffer between aggressive males, who coexist by claiming dense sections of plants as their territory. The vegetation also helps protect females during spawning, and baby fish, called fry, during their earliest and most vulnerable stages of development. Which brings us to betta courtship and reproduction, which, I gotta say again, is really interesting stuff, so thanks again, Dawn. Male bettas, even when no female is present, will regularly build bubble or foam nests of various sizes and thicknesses. These floating masses of bubbles are placed around plants or rocks that break the surface, and are blown with an oral secretion and saliva bubbles. The bubble nest is where fertilized eggs will be deposited and guarded by the male until they hatch. To show that they're interested in a female, male bettas flare their gills, spread their fins, and twist their bodies in a dance-like performance. Receptive females will respond by darkening in color and developing vertical lines that are called breeding bars. During courtship, the male betta sometimes exhibits aggressive behavior towards the female, chasing or nipping at her fins. But one study found that when males are in the bubble nest phase, their aggression towards females is low because they're trying to attract potential mates to their nest. Makes sense. Turns out that running after and chasing women aggressively is a poor way to get them to mate with you, no matter what your species is. It's also been found that in determining a suitable mate, females often do what's called eavesdropping on pairs of fighting males. When a female witnesses aggressive behavior between males, she's more likely to be attracted to the male who won. In contrast, if a female didn't eavesdrop on a fight, she has no preference. With males, the loser of a fight is more likely to attempt to court the female who didn't eavesdrop. I mean, she doesn't know he lost after all, while the winner shows no preference between an eavesdropping female and one who didn't. The act of spawning itself is called a nuptial embrace. Isn't that nice? Kind of romantic. Because the male wraps his body around the female. Now, during each embrace, somewhere between 10 and 40 eggs are released until the female is exhausted of her eggs. And with each deposit of eggs, the male releases his seminal fluid, which is called milt, into the water, and fertilization takes place externally. Now, during and after spawning, the male uses his mouth to retrieve any sinking eggs and to place them in the bubble nest. Some females help their partners, but More often than not, she simply eats all the eggs that she manages to catch. And this is why, once the female has released all her eggs, the male chases her away, because otherwise she's having omelets for dinner. The male, on the other hand, takes good care of his brood, carefully keeping them in his bubble nest, making sure none fall to the bottom, and repairing the bubble nest as needed. Shout out to the at-home dads. Incubation lasts for 24 to 36 hours, and newly hatched larvae remain in the nest for another 2 to 3 days until their yolk sacs are completely absorbed. Then the fry leave the nest and the free swimming stage begins. Now, in this first period of their lives, the fry are totally dependent on their gills to breathe. Now, that might seem like an obvious statement, and you might be thinking, duh, Tim, they're fish. Of course they depend on their gills to breathe. But some fish, bettas among them, develop something called a labyrinth organ, which allows them to take in oxygen directly from the air. In bettas, the labyrinth organ typically develops somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks of age. On a side note, because of this organ, fish that have one can survive for short periods out of the water, since they can inhale the air around them as long as they stay moist. Bettas reach sexual maturity in as early as 4 to 5 months, pretty quickly, which I'm sure didn't hurt all those selective breeding efforts over the last 1,000 years. Now, if you have a betta in an aquarium or in a jar at your house, you probably feed it some sort of commercial fish flake. But in the wild, bettas are naturally carnivorous, feeding on zooplankton, small crustaceans, and the larvae of aquatic insects like mosquitoes. Not to mention insects that fall into the water, and algae because, sometimes you need a little side salad. Contrary to some marketing materials in the pet trade, bettas cannot subsist solely on vegetation or the roots of plants. A brightly colored betta in a glass bowl gliding amongst the roots of a water-loving plant may be lovely and serene to watch, but you still need to feed that fish. Now, one of the drawbacks to the betta's worldwide popularity is that it's been released and has established itself in similar tropical areas outside of its native range, including Southeast Australia, Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, and the southeastern United States, also Singapore. As an invasive species, they can pose a threat to native fish, frogs, and other wetland species. And while their popularity has made them abundant in captivity, in the wild in their native range, betta habitats are threatened. They're either losing habitat due to the expansion of palm oil plantations, or their habitat is being polluted by chemicals and agricultural runoff, including human medication residue that enters the aquatic ecosystem from the sewage system. These contaminants can alter the reproductive behavior of the species by decreasing hatch rate and increasing the likelihood of fathers also eating their own eggs. In the wild, bettas are categorized by the IUCN as vulnerable, indicating they're likely to become endangered without conservation efforts. So, there you have it, everything you ever wanted to know about Siamese fighting fish. Thanks again to Dawn for suggesting it. I had a really great time researching and learning about this ubiquitous pet store fish. All right, here's the part where I ask you to support the podcast. If you want to support the podcast, here's how you do it. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get some sweet Dispatches from the Forest merch. Find all the details at patreon.com/dispatchesfromtheforest. You can donate through PayPal using my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. It's also how you can contact me if you have a question, a comment, or if you have a request for a future episode. If you want to just send a check, not a problem. Send me an email and I'll let you know what my mailing address is. Or you can donate using the Cash App and the hashtag ForestNerd. Go check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatchesfromtheforest. Click on products, find something you like. Finally, follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.